Hi, and welcome to Learning with Power. And I'm your host, Scott Powers Houston, and this is episode 3, The Fall of Rome. Alright, so basically the general theme for all of these lectures or episodes that I'm doing is where I'm taking on false narratives. And so in this lecture, I'm actually going to be taking on 2 false narratives. One being the fall of Rome, and the second one regarding the Byzantine Empire. And for this lecture, I've got much more definitive notes, and so I wasn't really able to just put it on cue cards or whatever. So I'm going to have to look down, like I'm doing a lecture. I'm going to have to actually look down at my notes sometimes. So apologize in advance for that. All right, so to start out with, so what are the false narratives? Well, the false narrative of the fall of Rome. Oh, so we're going to have 3 things. What are the false narratives? Then we're going to cover what really did happen, and then we're going to talk about how and why the false narratives came to be. All right, so the first one we'll take on is the fall of Rome, and the general false narrative is that, well, Rome fell in 476 A.D. due to decadence and just mismanagement and misbehavior by the emperors and things like that. And the fact is, that's just not true. And that was, again, that was a false narrative created by religion, basically. But we'll get back to that. But that's the first false narrative. So there's 4 academic reasons for the fall of Rome. Number 1, Christianity is attributed as one of the main factors for the fall of Rome. And what people say is, well, they lost their sense of values. That's BS. Anyway, also they say economic reasons, and they were relying too much on slaves. And again, that's something that we like to put from modern time perspective, apply it to them. That had nothing to do with it. Number 3, barbarian invasions. Well, yeah, I mean, that did have something to do with it, but they always had barbarian invasions. It's just that they became less able in the West to deal with them. And we'll get to why that happened. Number 4, just corruption, and in general, just, emperors behaving badly and things like that. And there were some very badly behaving emperors. That's not the reason. And then there's a 5th one that I add from my studying of history, which isn't really discussed as much by academics, but I think is actually the biggest reason why, and that would be basically just the size of the empire and the logistics of maintaining such a large empire with the technology that existed at the time. So, here you've got a ruling emperor in Rome, and there's some general on the field in Britain, and he wins a big victory, yay! And all the soldiers are very loyal to the general, and they all declare him emperor. And so he becomes a usurper. Well, news of this doesn't reach Rome until the troops with this usurper are like right on the doorstep. Because basically what has to happen is there's got to be a runner sent all the way across Europe. He's got to run from Britain, get across the channel somehow, and literally run from northern France all the way down to Rome in order to deliver a scroll and deliver the message to the emperor that this usurper is taking place. So that's why, so communications were very slow. And so that was a big problem when you're trying to administer an empire that's as large as the Roman Empire had become. Just like basically almost the size of the United States is today. So that, I think, is the bigger reason. But that's not the narrative, though, that I want to explain. Actually, the narrative that I want to explain is that actually the fall of Rome did not happen. Rome, in fact, never did fall. And you're like, oh, well, no. Yes, it did. No, it didn't actually. And but what did happen is basically. Okay, so we're talking about Diocletian. Okay, so in 286, Diocletian realized that the empire was getting to be too large logistically to manage anymore. And so he, in a very pragmatic way, divided the empire into three parts, three administrative areas. And the Western administration part of Rome at that time actually was he put it in Milan. So Rome, at that point, you know, the emperor of Rome kind of became unimportant at that point because the leader in Rome was the Pope by then. Even though Diocletian persecuted Christians, which is why he's not really looked at favorably in history. But he was the last emperor to persecute Christians. It's because of that's why he's not looked at very well. But it was a very pragmatic thing to do, divided up into three parts. And the one administrative part in the west he put in Milan, because it was much more centrally located to deal with all the barbarian invasions and things, and to deal with the rest of Europe. He put the other one in Egypt. He put another leader in Egypt to deal with basically Egypt and the Levant and Africa and parts east there. And then also, the last one was Nicomedia, which is where he hung out, was in Nicomedia, which is in present-day Turkey. So that was considered to be the east. All right. So then, after Diocletian, came Constantine. And Constantine decided, you know what, this is a good idea, but really the more pragmatic place to put a central capital, since the logistics and the dynamics and the size and you know where the threats were coming in the Roman Empire really, and as far as trade that they were doing with the East and things like that, the most strategic place to put it would be Byzantium. And there was a town called Byzantium, and so which today is Istanbul. And he was right. I mean, that was a fantastic location to choose as a capital. And so he decided to make that the new capital city, because even under Diocletian, as I mentioned, Rome had become less important, even by that point. But it was still the same empire. So just because it wasn't ruled from Rome doesn't mean that it wasn't the Roman Empire. I mean, we don't call the United States Washingtonian or Washington or whatever, you know, that just happens to be where the capital is. So to put it in a more modern perspective, so they moved everything to Constantinople, and they made Constantinople the center of the empire, and they built this little town of Byzantium, changed the name to Constantinople, which is a Greek name, whereas Byzantium was a Latin name. So that right away should give you a clue about how things are changing. And so they decided to build up this city and make it the most fortified, grandest, most wonderful city on earth. And it was a great success. Indeed, they did build Constantinople into the most well fortified and the richest and the best city on earth by far. It was a great success. So to put that in modern perspective, let's say that we don't have the internet and things like that, and let's say that Canada and Mexico are very aggressive. And so, you know, we're dealing with invasions from Canada. Yeah, they're pretty important, but the better place to put a capital maybe is not Washington, D.C. in America, since we have designs on expanding through Mexico and we can go all the way into South America, right? So maybe the best place to have a capital would really be Phoenix. And even though Phoenix is already a substantial city, maybe, you know, we should really put the focus of everything right there in Phoenix. And so imagine that all the major corporations and General Motors and Google and everybody all moves to Phoenix and puts their headquarters there in Phoenix. And we kind of sort of, but you know, DC still has its administrators. You know, it's still an important administrative center, but where it's at is Phoenix. And then, you know, you've got young people who are just like oh, well, Washington, D.C. is just so last century. I mean, the place to be now is Phoenix. You really got to be in Phoenix. Well, that's basically what was happening in Rome. The place to be became Constantinople. Rome was no longer cool. And you have other belligerents too in the West that they had to deal with. But they also had belligerents in the East that they had to deal with, which is why they put the capital in Constantinople. And so the empire, it wasn't a new empire. They just simply changed the location or the headquarters of where it was going to be administered from, or where the capital was going to be. And so the reality of Rome actually is that it did not fall. And so, well, how can you say that, Scott? It's not around anymore. Something happened to it. Yeah. Overall, through its entire life, and it had various different incarnations, but over its entire life, actually, Rome lasted for 2,200 years. About exactly, from 747 BC to 1453 AD. It's the longest lasting empire that reached the greatest heights relative to the rest of the world that there's ever been. And it didn't actually just fall or collapse suddenly or within a century or whatever. It was a very gradual thing. It's just, there were different incarnations of it. There were different changes. So at a certain point it was hard to call the Byzantine Empire, which was never called the Byzantine Empire at that time. It was never a country called the Byzantine Empire. There was never a place called the Byzantine Empire. And the people that lived there did not call themselves Byzantines or people of the Byzantine Empire or whatever. That is a name that was applied much later on by historians in the 18th century. But the... okay, so if it wasn't the Byzantine Empire, so what did the people in this Eastern Roman Empire call themselves? And I want to stress that we refer to it today as the Eastern Roman Empire, but at the time they did not. It was just Rome. Rome was one empire. There was no East, there was no West. There was an emperor that was located in the West, and an emperor that was located in the East, but it wasn't called the Eastern and Western Empire, which is two different administrative units or places of the same empire. But the people in the East did have a different culture, just because they evolved, they had different influences and social influences and cultural influences, obviously, than people that were in Europe. And so the people in the East spoke more Greek, and so they called themselves, actually, the name of the country, if you were saying, what's the name of your empire, they would call it the Il Imperium de Romanoi. So Imperium is a Latin name, but Romanoi is actually kind of like a Greek, the way that the Greeks refer to themselves, which means basically the empire of the Romans. That's the same as like the kingdom of the Franks, later on in like 800 AD. Charlemagne was the head of the kingdom of the Franks. You didn't have countries like France and Belgium and Italy with passports and things like that. They didn't have a concept of that. They didn't have a concept of country. There was an empire, but they didn't have a concept of like individual countries. So it was just Il Imperium de Romanoi. And so once they established Constantinople as the main capital, and it was flourishing and doing very well, because Rome kind of became, so last century, let's say, and also they were starting to have sort of like, so in 313 AD, there was called the Edict of Milan. And you have Constantine, and the reason why he's called Constantine the Great is because supposedly he embraced Christianity and made Christianity the religion of Rome. That's not really how it happened. Basically, all they did was just to tolerate Christianity within Rome. And he got together with Licinius, who was the Western emperor, and a guy named Miltiades, who was the Pope at the time. And they created the Edict of Milan, which allowed Christians to pray and preach, and they no longer had to be in hiding. It became legal to be Christian. Before it was illegal. So from that point on, Christianity was accepted, And so you can't really point at Christianity as being a reason for the fall of the empire, because in 313 AD everything was fine. So, and the administrative person in Rome anymore wasn't that important anymore anyway. The first real emperor, I mean the first real pope to really be like the pope and to establish like the office of the pope was really Clement the First, 88 to 99. He set up the beginning of what became the papal became the pope. Before that time, you know, later on in Christianity, the narrative goes back and says, oh, well, Peter was the first pope, da, 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 da. Just to try to make it seem like there was continuity, and also to try to connect it all the way back to Jesus, because that's the whole narrative, right, is to bring it all the way back to Jesus. But in fact, Christianity within Rome didn't exist hardly at all until around 110 AD. And then suddenly it became like a big fad, and it just like exploded. And basically Diocletian was the last emperor that tried to suppress that. And they basically Constantine just agreed, and Licinius just agreed to just, you know, we're not going to put this down, and we're just going to create more problems trying to put it down. It's not that big a deal, so we'll just allow Christianity. So that was in 313 AD. All right, so, and so now that became the center of the empire. Even now, it's even a Christian empire. And in fact, it was more Christian at first than even the West was, because the West still, most of the people still practice the old traditions like Saturnalia and stuff like that. Even though the Pope was over there, as far as culturally, Christianity kind of really took hold in Constantinople more than it did even in the West. And so since that became the place to be, funding for things in the West became less available, because that was they just weren't cool anymore. You know, it just wasn't hip anymore. You know, it just wasn't really the place to be anymore. And so the West started to deteriorate a little bit because they just did not have the funds anymore to maintain the infrastructure. And so barbarians did create a problem. The invasions of the barbarians did create a problem, but they could have been kept at bay had they had more funding from Constantinople. But because they didn't have as much funding, they weren't able to keep them back anymore. But it wasn't like because they were decadent or whatever, and they just, you know, everything collapsed. It didn't collapse. It just changed the priority, and the priority became Constantinople, and not so much the city of Rome. And the people, if you lived in the empire at that time, you would have no perception of one empire ended and another one began, or one empire is different from another empire. You wouldn't perceive it that way. It's all just Rome. You know, whether you were living in the Levant or in Constantinople or even in Milan, you wouldn't have any perception that there had been any kind of a change. But you were aware of, you know, of like barbarian invasions and things. So finally you have this guy called Justinian who takes over. And Justinian was a very fantastic, great emperor. And he was very effective. And in fact, he started building a great church called Hagia Sophia. And even though the Middle Ages is considered the Dark Ages, in West or Eastern Rome, you know, technology continued to advance. And as religion became more and more important, you know, the technology as far as architecture went just focused on church building. And really, Hagia Sophia was just state-of-the-art architecture. And it was really a remarkable achievement when you consider, you know, when it was built, which was in the 500s AD, the 6th century. And even today, it's an impressive-looking structure. And but Justinian also did other things. He started the first codexes. Basically, Diocletian actually really started modern law. But because actually he was a very effective administrator, even though he persecuted Christians. Justinian took it one step further and wrote it all down and made codexes, and that's why we call it Justinian law. And so British law and parliamentary law and US law and all the modern legal systems in the West today all find its foundations of law in Justinian law, the Justinian codexes. And then the other thing that Justinian did was that he reacquired Italy, and he got back most of the Western Empire that had been lost. And so he kind of reunited Rome again and made it this great empire that went all the way from the western part of, or the eastern part of France, all the way into the Middle East, into the Levant, down into Egypt and northern Africa. The whole thing was again Rome, and you can't really say that Rome collapsed or ended in 476 AD when Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565 AD, under Justinian everything was fine and unified. So how can you say that ended? How can you say that the empire ended in 476 when in 565 it was doing fine? So, but the one thing that they did lose, though, in the meantime, was they lost Gaul, and but they had recently lost Gaul, and so in Gaul there was a guy who emerged called Clovis between 489 and 511 AD, something like that, and he became he was called a king, and it was called a kingdom, the kingdom of Gaul, or the kingdom of the Franks, and Clovis was the first king, and he was the first king of all the monarchs of Europe, actually. And that was around 500 AD, so Justinian came in just after that. He couldn't really do anything at that point about Gaul, but all of the rest of the empire he was able to put back under the administrative of Constantinople. And so it became more unified again. Problem is, and this happens frequently in history, so it happened with Charlemagne and his sons, and a lot of the successors to a lot of the really great emperors or the really great leaders or kings or whatever were not necessarily great. And so the succeeding emperors after Justinian were not so effective anymore, and they did not prioritize the West, and so they started to lose control of some areas, and they were getting a lot of, in the late 500s, they were getting a very aggressive threat coming from the east, the Sasanians and Khusru the Great. And the Sasanians, and this is before they were Muslim, were making a lot of inroads into Rome, or what we call the Byzantine Empire now. And so it started to sort of fade at that point as far as the overall strength. And then there was a guy that took over in 602, and his name was Phocas, Phocas, and he was a piece of work. And he was a disaster. He was the most ineffective, most brutal and ruthless emperor as far as all the documentation goes. That there's one of the worst ever. And it couldn't have come at a worse time, because in the early 600s they were getting not only threats from the barbarians and the Lombards and the Ostrogoths and Visigoths and people like that, but they were also getting a lot of raids from the east, the Sasanians. And in 610, Muhammad emerged. In 610, Muhammad has his vision of St. Gabriel coming down to him and talking to him, and suddenly you have the Persians, or the people from the east, the Saracens, or they're not the Sasanians anymore. Actually, Tabaristan took over after Sasanian. But those people, now are Muslim, and they became extra motivated because now they're fighting for God, and God is on our side, and we're going to prevail. Now, God was pretty strong in the West as well. I mean, Christianity had become very dominant. And you can look at Christianity as, how did it grow? Well, it grew because of word of mouth, kind of like multi-level marketing. It was sort of like the first multi-level marketing, actually, that really ever was successful. And one of the main pitches of Christianity was that you did not have to be rich to go. There was a place called heaven, which was never really established in religion before, and in order to go there, You didn't have to be rich. You could be poor. And in fact, the poorer you were, the better chance you had. And this was a new thing. Because before, literally in Judaism, you had to actually make sacrifices and pray. And like the bigger your sacrifices, the more, the better your place in heaven was going to be. And so literally the rich people could secure the best places in heaven because they could afford to make the grandest sacrifices. And poor people could only have a little pittance of a sacrifice, and so for them, they had no chance of making a great place in heaven. Well, Christianity changed all that, and it made the poor people, gave power to the poor people. And of course, that was the majority, that was the masses, and so that's why it spread like wildfire. And so you have the Muslims now, they're motivated by their new religion, and they're inspired by Muhammad, and now you've got the two of them fighting each other now in the east, in Turkey basically, and they are destroying each other and weakening each other significantly. Another thing that happened is Heraclius took over in 610 AD from Phocas, thank goodness, and Heraclius was pretty effective, but by that time the problems were already there. They already existed. He inherited a mess, and he ruled from 610 to 641. And the first thing he did was he realized that the empire at that point was focused in the east, and pretty much everybody spoke Greek. And so Latin was no longer the official language. He made Greek actually the official language in 610 AD. And so that is Heraclius. And at this time, Heraclius was from 610 to 641 AD. And at this time, they had lost control of Gaul. They had lost control of Britannia a while ago. They had lost control of most of Italy, including Rome. And the language now was Greek. And so everybody in the empire is speaking Greek. And so you can't really call it Rome anymore, I guess, if everybody is speaking Greek and they don't even have control of the city of Rome anymore. So I guess that's why I point to 610 AD as the end of the Western the Western Roman Empire. But the empire actually still carried on. I mean, in 611 AD, you didn't perceive that in 610 AD the empire had changed. You know that there was a proclamation that said Greek is now the language and no longer Latin, but everybody was speaking Greek by then anyway, so they didn't perceive that as any kind of a change. It's just like, it would be just the same as if that same country in modern times that now had the capital in Phoenix lost control of Washington, D.C., that these Quebecans came down through Vermont, which wasn't well defended, and through western Massachusetts, which wasn't too defended, and through the Adirondacks, whatever, and they came down and attacked the capital, Washington, D.C., and took it over. But Phoenix was so strong and powerful and so rich, they didn't really even care that much that they were losing Washington, D.C., because that was becoming passé anyway. And there was still a religious leader in Washington, D.C. that was more important anyway. So it didn't even matter. And so then they say, well, you know what, we're all speaking Arizonan. We don't really speak this English anymore. Or let's say Spanish. We're all speaking Spanish now. We're based in Phoenix, and everybody here speaks Spanish. We don't really speak English anymore. That was old school. When the English came over, and it was an East Coast country, and they settled in the East, and English, that was what they did then. This is now. This is hundreds of years later. Now we all speak Spanish, so we're going to make the official language now Spanish. And so if they did that, that wouldn't necessarily be the end of the empire, but language is a very unifying force within countries or empires or within groups of people historically. So that's why I point to that time as being the end of Rome or the Western Rome. But in fact, again, if you were living in the empire at that time, you wouldn't have perceived that that was the end. And so, moving on, that empire continued to grow and grow and grow. And even through the fourth, well, not grow, but I mean, it continued to prosper. And there was, they had ups and down periods, and they still had a lot of problems with the Sasanians. And actually, it never got as rich again as it was in, say, 600 AD, because in the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire was really devastated financially from all the losses of battling the Persians. But also the East was devastated as well. They also were a lot weakened, and even though they had the ability to run roughshod over northern Africa, it still didn't mean that it was a rich, prosperous country anymore. So, but the Eastern Roman Empire went on even through the period of the Fourth Crusade. And in the Fourth Crusade, you have these religious zealot crusaders coming from the West, and they wanted to take over the Levant. And that was one of the problems that, one of the things that Phocas did was he lost the Levant. So that was another problem. So that created a need for getting it back again in the perception of the Crusaders. So in the Fourth Crusade, they were supposed to go and again try to retake the Levant. But instead what they did was they went rogue and they attacked Constantinople. Why? Because it was such a rich city and it was so enticing. And they thought, gee, you know what? We might be able to actually get over the series of walls that they have and their defenses and actually take some of those riches. And they did actually. They took over the Constantinople was overrun. They were totally caught by surprise. They did not see this coming. Suddenly, out of nowhere, comes this huge army horde from the West, from Europe, coming and attacking them. And so they did, for a while, lose Constantinople even as the capital city, and they had to be based in another city in modern-day Turkey for about 60 years or so, until the Fourth Crusaders left, and then they retook Constantinople. But the empire didn't die. In fact, it didn't die until 1453. And actually, when it died, that cut off trade from the West, from the East, entirely. Because you had two, basically, avenues of trade between the East and the West at that time. One of them was the Silk Route, and that was cut off by the Ming Dynasty. But right around the same time, Constantinople falls, and so now you have to deal directly with the Muslims for trade. And after 300 years of crusades, the relationship with the Muslims wasn't real good. So no trade with the East at that point. And so that's what spawned the need for the West and for the age of exploration. And so for Columbus to try to find a better way to India, not so much China maybe, but India, because China had cut off trade anyway. And so that really was the end of the empire of 1453. And so it was founded in 757, it ends in, or 747, and it ends in 1453. That's 2,200 years. All right, so why did the empire fall? Well, it wasn't Christianity. They were Christian for over 1,000 years. It wasn't because they were relying on slaves. Economically, that wasn't the problem. In fact, still, at the time of Heraclius, in let's say 641 AD, this is the second narrative, which is that the Byzantine Empire was not significant. It was not important. It was just, like maybe it was like the Sasanians at the time, or it was like no better than maybe the Gupta Empire, which existed at that time. It was not that big a deal. It was not really important. It was insignificant. And more than that, the people there were Byzantine, which meant that they were harsh and crude and ruthless and godless, decadent and godless. And so therefore, a non-entity, not important. We don't even, and today, even to this day in schools all over the West, even in Europe and in America especially, nobody talks about the Byzantine Empire. It's like, it's just not important. When in fact it was the most powerful, most important, most influential, and certainly the richest place in the world. And the only place that could really rival that was possibly Tang Dynasty China as it started to evolve a little bit. But really, nobody could match the riches of Constantinople. And that's why the Fourth Crusaders attacked them, was because it was so rich and such a big, impressive city. So it wasn't economics, it wasn't because they relied on slaves, it wasn't even corruption. Even though you had, and it wasn't decadence, it wasn't that they all, just were fornicating and everything, and it wasn't corruption either, because all monarchies have good kings and bad kings, and so just like monarchies with emperors, you had some good emperors and some bad emperors, and that's the problem when you have too much authority based in one person. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, as was said later on. But it wasn't corruption. That's not why it declined. The main reason why ultimately the Eastern Roman Empire did decline is because they were surrounded now by Muslims, and they were being attacked on all sides by Muslims, and eventually they just were able to make more inroads and more inroads and more inroads over hundreds of years. More inroads and more inroads, until finally the whole empire was just centered and focused in the city of Constantinople, and then that stood for like another 100 years, and then finally they were able to take over that, and trade with the East was over. All right, and so how and why did these false narratives evolve? Well, okay, the first reason was, okay, so you have basically academia and colleges and universities are emerging now in the 1600s, and in the 1700s it became a thing. And you've got professors and historians now in the 18th century, the 1700s, who are trying to explain, the Dark Ages. Well, the Dark Ages, before the Dark Ages there was this great, non-religious Roman Empire. Then we were focused on religion, and we had this thing called the Dark Ages, so you have to explain that. And so the way that they explained the Dark Ages was they said, oh, well, what happened was Rome was very decadent, and they were just, they had no morals, and they were just, there was no control, and people were just behaving so badly. And much like God did with Babylon and what he did with Sodom and Gomorrah, he realized that this was a bad place and he had to destroy it. And so he destroyed Rome, and it was very swift. It was very strong, and and then just 50 years later, boom, it came crashing down because God's wrath came in because they were behaving so badly. And that's the narrative that still pervades even until the 21st century, which is just complete BS. That's not what happened at all. The other false narrative is that you have the other false narrative is with the Byzantine Empire, and that it wasn't significant or important. In fact, it was very important. But the reason for saying that the Byzantine Empire was not important that narrative begins in 1054 with this thing called the Great Schism. And so what happened is even though the Bible was developed in the Eastern Roman Empire, in which today the Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea, and that's in Turkey, and that's where they developed the Bible. Still, the philosophy of the Pope in Rome and the philosophies of the religious leaders in what's now Turkey, in Anatolia, had become very different in their opinions. If you look back on it, and historically, wasn't really a big difference, but to them it was a big difference. And finally they just decided that we're going to have irreconcilable differences, and this isn't going to work anymore, and so the two churches decided to split. And so you'd have your Western church and you're going to have your Eastern Christian church, and so it was called the Great Schism. It happened in 1054, and it's a very similar thing to what happened again with the Protestant Revolution or the Reformation with Martin Luther. And it was a very similar thing that happened with in Muslim religion between the Shiites and the Sunnis. They also split, and for similar sorts of reasons. And so, because in the 1700s, when you have historians trying to explain what happened to all that, that's why they decided that the Byzantine Empire just wasn't important and was just decadent, because they were that other religion. It's like Protestant versus Catholic. That other religion, they don't count, it doesn't matter. It was Christian, but still false gods, because they weren't really following our ways. And so that's why the narrative became that it was not significant, or not a significant place, and we still don't study Byzantine history because it's not considered to be important enough. Okay, and so that concludes the lecture. And so I've discussed what the false narratives were and how they got to be those false narratives and what really happened. And so now you know the real history. All right, and so that concludes this lecture and this episode of Learning with Power. Please join us probably in a week's time when we have the next episode of Learning with Power with Scott Powers Houston. Hope to see you there. Take care.